Now, the camera is arguably one of the most important parts of the filmmaking process because without it, you wouldn't have anything to watch. But if you're picking one for the first time, it can be very overwhelming with all of the different choices out there. So I've been spending some time testing out the latest cameras to help figure out which one is the best one for your videos. Hey everyone, Camber here, showing you how to use your camera to make good videos. And it's important to realize that the camera is just a tool in the filmmaking process, and going out and buying the most expensive one you can find isn't going to automatically make your videos good. It's learning how to use that camera well to tell a story that's really going to make your videos stand out. And rather than give you multiple camera options like I used to, I'm going to go ahead and give you my choice camera for beginner filmmakers in 2022, and that is the Sony ZV-E10 for $700, which I'll have linked in the description for the best price I could find on Amazon. And I'm going to compare it with a couple other popular options in the Canon M50 Mark II for $600 and the Panasonic GH4 for $700 to $1,000 depending on the sale that's going on at the time. And I want to point out here that a lot of people seem to think that beginner also means inexpensive. However, filmmaking is definitely not a cheap hobby to get into, and these cameras are actually quite inexpensive compared to professional video gear. So instead of just going out and getting the cheapest camera that you can find and quickly realizing that it doesn't meet all of your needs, it's better to invest a little more now in a camera that's really going to last you a long time. So as I go through the video specs on the Sony, I'll point out the important ones and compare it with the other cameras to show you why the Sony is a better all-around option for the beginner filmmaker. And no, I'm not sponsored by Sony. So first off, the Sony ZV-E10, I don't know why they didn't come up with an easier name for the camera, but whatever, is equipped with an APS-C size sensor, which gives you a crop of 1.5 on whatever lens you're using. Or in other words, your 50mm lens will be like using a 75mm lens on this camera. The M50 Mark II also has an APS-C sensor with a 1.6 times crop. However, the GH4 comes with a micro four thirds sensor, which is even smaller and gives you a 2 times crop on your image, making that 50mm lens like a 100mm. And I don't like going smaller than an APS-C size sensor because of the large crop, and you won't get as good a low light performance because of the smaller pixels on the smaller sensor. However, if you light your scene properly, you'll still get good results, but as a beginner, I know you're probably not investing money in a lot of quality lights yet. Next up, you get 4K video at 24 frames per second, as well as Full HD up to 120 frames per second, giving you really nice slow motion, although there is a slight crop of 1.14 times in that mode. Whereas the other two cameras max out at 60 frames per second in Full HD, which the Sony also has with no crop in that mode. However, not all 4K is the same. When in Full HD, you get the standard APS-C crop that I mentioned earlier on both the Sony and Canon cameras. But once you switch to 4K, the Sony uses the full sensor to actually read out at 6K and then downsample to 4K for recording, whereas the Canon crops in an additional 1.5 times, making your 50mm lens like a 120mm, which can be very limiting depending on how much space you have available. And the autofocus that works great on the M50 Mark II when using the whole sensor readout in Full HD is pretty much useless once you switch to 4K because of the huge crop which limits the pixel readout of the autofocus system, making it extremely unreliable. Whereas the 6K to 4K downsampling on the Sony using the full sensor gives the same great autofocus capabilities in 4K that you get in Full HD. And for this reason alone, I would never go with the Canon M50 Mark II unless you only plan on shooting in Full HD. And the same issues are present in the similarly priced Canon T8i and SL3 cameras. All the cameras have an articulating touchscreen giving you the ability to use touch autofocus and see yourself when recording, which is great for vlogging or videos like this. This feature is a must-have for me now and is an upgrade to the A6100 that I suggested last year that only had a tilting screen that would get blocked by a microphone. But it's not all good. Something that the Sony lacks as compared to the other cameras is a viewfinder. However, I never actually used mine on any of my previous cameras because I always looked at the rear screen for video and even when taking photos, so it's not really an issue for me, but that is something to consider if you want that option. Another feature that the Sony has compared to the Canon is its unlimited video recording capability, whereas the Canon has the standard 30-minute video recording limit, which is always a surprise to beginners when your camera stops recording at 30 minutes because you don't expect it to quit recording unless you run out of battery or your SD card gets full. The GH4 gives you up to 220 minutes of recording time, which in all reality is plenty, but the Sony does come out on top with truly unlimited capability, which is ideal for podcasts or other long-form recording scenarios. Another upgrade that the ZV-E10 has over my previous suggestion of the Sony a6100 is the addition of picture profiles. And if you're not familiar with this, it records a more washed out looking image on your screen, but it gives you a lot more leeway for color grading later on. And you also have the option of overlaying LUTs on top of that so that you can see what it could look like, and it helps you with things like white balance and getting exposure right while you're taking the video, so you're not just looking at a washed out image. And the Canon M50 Mark II doesn't have picture profile options, although you can go in and go to more neutral picture setting where there's less contrast, less saturation, or you can go in and do your own custom setting to make it even lower, but it's not quite the same as doing a picture profile. And the final thing to bring up in choosing the Sony over the other cameras are the differences in lens mounts. The Canon M50 Mark II uses an EFM mount with limited lens options that you won't be able to use once you upgrade to a full-frame Canon camera, and would require an adapter to be able to use the higher quality EF Canon lenses. The GH4 on the other hand has a good selection of lenses. However, you'd be in the same position of not being able to use those lenses when upgrading to a full-frame Panasonic camera. But the Sony camera uses the same E-mount for all of Sony's high-quality lenses that you'd be able to use on any of the mirrorless full-frame or cinema cameras from Sony when you upgrade in the future. But that's what makes this a great beginner camera for well under $1,000. So if you have any other questions about the features of this camera, then post them down in the comments and I can help you out there. But if you do have a larger budget to invest in a camera that will really last you a long time, the Sony a7C for $1,800 is a great choice. It has a full-frame sensor which will give you much better performance in low light and a shallower depth of field. It has an articulating touchscreen that gives you the ability to use touch autofocus and tracking, but the downside for those that like a viewfinder is that it has a tiny viewfinder that's pretty much useless for photos when compared to something like the Canon EOS R, so you'll need to stick with the rear monitor for that, just like on the smaller Sony ZV-E10. The a7C uses the same 6K to 4K downsampling that we mentioned earlier to get a full readout of the sensor for 4K, whereas the similarly priced Canon EOS R has a crop of 1.7 times when shooting 4K, which will almost double the focal length of your lens. The a7C will give you up to 120 frames per second in full HD for that nice slow motion, whereas the comparable EOS R maxes out at 60 frames per second in full HD. And I know a lot of folks are more familiar with Canon and want to buy that brand because of that, just like I used to. But after using Canon for a couple years and seeing how limiting their video features are, I decided to make the switch to Sony, and I have not looked back. But remember that the camera is just a tool in the filmmaking process, and it's the skills you learn and how to use that tool to tell a good story that will really set your films apart. And I have a lot of other videos on the channel that are linked in the description to help you with learning to use your new camera to tell a better story. So regardless of what camera you choose, just be sure to practice with it every day so that you can learn how to shape those shots and make them flow to tell a better story. But if this video is helpful, then please hit that like button and subscribe with the bell so you'll be notified of new videos in the future. I have a private Facebook group linked in the description that I can better answer your filmmaking questions, and lots of other people can help you out as well. And with that, I'll see you soon.